So we've dealt with some of this material previously as we went through that workbook with the Torah portions. And so we've already got a really good foundation for this in terms of looking at that heavenly chariot, looking at the Egyptian chariot, and so forth. So let me get this screen thing going here. And I added in the Haftarah section, you'll notice in addition to Ezekiel 43:10 through 27, I also added Ezekiel Chapter 1 through 28. And if you're in the Tuesday class and you're listening to this before Tuesday class, if you would pre-read that Haftarah, because when we start talking about the chariot tomorrow, I think it's going to help you to have that fresh in your memory in terms of what those four living creatures looked like and about the numbers of wings, because there's a little bit of a disparity between what Ezekiel sees in the vision of the chariot and what John sees in the vision of the chariot. And so we're going to reconcile that and say, you know, here's a possibility as to why they're saying two different things. Number one, they're having visions of two different time periods. But pre-reading that would help, by the way. And then you would obviously be comparing it to Revelation chapter 21. And the specific verses would be 17 through 26, but it never hurts to read an entire chapter for the context. So the title of the Torah portion is Tetzaveh, Command. And what we're going to look at again is the four fires of the Mishkan and how they relate to the Merkavah, or the chariot. Merkavah means chariot, by the way. So let's take, it's acting kind of weird, just kind of slow. Let's see. Were you guys able to see that just now when I had it up? You couldn't see it. Okay, that might explain. Let's try again. Okay. Play from start. Okay, now can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Not sure what's going on right now. At any rate, I wanted to go ahead and put the Hebrew text up right beside the English, because we're going to be looking primarily at light. That's going to be the thing that ties this particular Torah portion to the Merkavah, to the vision of John. Because obviously John's vision is going to open with the 7 lamps of the menorah, right? And there's even a thread as it opens up as he's speaking to the 7 assemblies, which we know are very specifically the 7 Moedim. And there's a linguistic connection here. I still feel like it's skipped one on me. There it is. I don't know why that's hiding. Okay, let's back up a second. Someone had challenged me because I had asked you to go ahead and make you your own index cards or your own index of Torah portions. And in the new workbook too, it's actually pre-printed for you with spaces, the Torah portions where you can write, and you'll have your own little diary or log index of the Torah portions. So somebody challenged me, can you please help us get started with this? And so here's just to show you how that might work, even though you would have more information on your index for the portion, because obviously it's going to talk about the high priest and topics we're not going to have time to cover. But just to show you how you can match up topics. The title of the Torah portion is Tetzaveh, which means command, right? You can hear tzva within that. But we know that Moses has this revelation on Mount Sinai, which is also called Chorev. And we're going to look at that particular word and why I think it's telling us why the Midbar is important. But by revelation on Chorev, Moses is given the Torah commandment to bring the oil, or to tell the Israelites to bring the oil, to light the 7 golden candlesticks. And this is going to be a 7-branch menorah. And the idea of this commandment is, I want you to make it shine through the night. That seems to be the emphasis here. I want it to shine through the darkness. I want it to go from evening until morning. And that particular phrase, you already have a context for. Your first mention of evening and morning obviously is going to be back in Genesis chapter 1, discussing the creation. And in next week's Torah portion, I want to revisit that, and I want to look at the Mishkan as a repetition of the creation, the commands of creation, very specifically. So we also have in this revelation, because Moses is told to create the Mishkan just according to the pattern that he was shown. So we have this 7-branch menorah that's going to be housed in the Mishkan. And also in the Mishkan, there's going to be a weaving. There's going to be a curtain, a veil. And uncharacteristically, it's going to have the image of something heavenly. Of course, the Torah is a book that completely rejects images, graven images, particularly images that you would tend to worship, that you would attribute some power to that image. He doesn't want us making images of things to worship, but he wanted a representation of the cherubim on these weavings. And that's what we'll kind of maybe explore that as we go through the heavenly chariot and so forth. It might tell us why it was important for there to be a representation of the cherubim. The most obvious being that they guarded the way to the garden. And so if you see this representation of the 2 cherubim, then as you go to worship in the Mishkan, or if you think about worshiping in the Mishkan, that image might be in your head, and it might remind you of the point of worship. The whole goal of what we're doing, obviously, is to have that restoration to the garden. There's an idea of resurrection that having those cherubim there might have encouraged people that, yes, there is a point in this. It's not just all, dead bulls and goats. It's not just, bringing money or whatever it is you want to contribute. There's a point to this. Don't forget the point. Don't get so caught up in the details you forget the point. And that is to serve Adonai. Because if you cannot serve Adonai, then you cannot live in the garden. You just can't, because that was the whole point of the garden. They were to work the ground, right? They were to serve, and they were to guard it. If you can't do those 2 things, how in the world do you think you're going to live in the garden? How can you expect to be resurrected and enjoy full garden privileges if you can't do those 2 things? Why would he resurrect you to do the very thing we got kicked out for? So having those cherubim would have been a reminder, even of the importance of the commandments. Because remember, we got 2 dynamics going on. We've got the Egypt dynamic, which is going to be salvation from death. But then we've got the Babylon dynamic, which takes us into Revelation, where the goal is holiness. And so there's a wilderness in between them. when we're thinking of those two concepts. And a lot of times if we talk about the commandments, we might hear Tetzaveh. We might hear a clear command coming from the Torah and we want to obey that. Someone else might hear it and say, oh, you're trying to earn your salvation. And I say, no, I'm learning to walk in holiness. He brought me out of death, but if I'm going to go into the garden, then there are certain expectations, basically two. I have to be able to do the original two things that I was created to do, which was to serve in the garden and to guard that garden. And so he's going to take me into the wilderness to see if, number one, I will serve, and number two, if I will be tempted into letting my guard down. And if I don't pass the test, there will be serpents, right? And in the wilderness, what did the Israelites encounter? Serpents. So at any rate, we know that the cherubim are part of that identity of the four living creatures that Ezekiel saw, and that they represent the spirit of the living God. And that wherever the spirit goes, those four living creatures had to go. One did not leave the other. It was chayot, means living creatures, but it also means wild beasts. So we've got a contronym going on there that we'll look at later when we look at the four altar judgments, and one of them is the wild beast, or the chaya. And that's going to be interesting too, because we've looked several times at how the chariots are actually the chariot. They're one, but they're many. And so when he describes the four altar judgments, and he describes that one of them is wild beasts. Okay, it's usually translated as plural, but it's not. It's chaya. It's singular. So is there one wild beast, or are there many wild beasts? Yes. So there's specific language there that we'll look at in Hebrew that's going to make us think about that whole chariot wheel thing with the Egyptians. Okay, so it's a command, Tetzaveh. If I'm reading, let's say in Revelation, because that's our example this week, I know that John is having a revelation. So that part's not going to be hard. But we know that Moses received the commandment to build the Mishkan by revelation on the mountain. In fact, in Judaism, the giving of the Torah is the revelation. It's not a book in the New Testament. That's the revelation. So to a first century mindset, it's not really an either or proposition. Whatever John is going to see is going to be an affirmation of whatever was revealed at Sinai. And so John is going to see these seven assemblies as a menorah. In fact, he's very specific. Basically, he says, if you don't accept these rebukes and you don't repent, then I will break off your lampstand. I'll break off your branch from the lampstand. So the themes are the same, right? John is going to see a theme of the menorah. If I say, well, okay, where have I seen this menorah before? The seven candlesticks, a commandment. Then I can go back and look at my index, and I can say, oh, well, this Torah portion, Tetzaveh, it actually starts out with the seven branch menorah. I'm onto something here. It could be that this Torah portion will explain for me what John is seeing. And the same thing with the Torah portion, Baha'alocha. It also sets out explaining to you how to kindle the lamps. So either of those two Torah portions, you can count on there being some way to help you decode what John is seeing without buying a novel series called Left Behind. All right, so he's saving you a lot of money here, guys. Everybody's got a copy of the Bible. I mean, and if you don't, just call up the Gideons. They'll bring you a free one. So the word itself is very, it's without cost, really, to us. But the work that has to be done, you see the kind of the salvation, holiness thing? Salvation it doesn't cost you anything, but to grow in holiness will cost you everything. And it's going to be a measure of your work, of your service, and your ability to guard the tree of life. All right, and so we also have, if we look here, the four living creatures are going to pop up in the book of Revelation. And in this weaving of the cherubim and the Mishkan, which I would have to read forward into Ezekiel and Isaiah to make the connection, but assuming that we have, we would know that they were talking about the cherubim that we see not just in Bereshit, but we also see it right here in this Torah portion, Tetzaveh. And so if we're understanding the four living creatures, then we go back to the weaving of the tabernacle and say, what was their role there? What were they doing there? And at this point, we have to sprinkle in, a thimbleful of rabbinic tradition. Because if we don't know the Genesis tradition of the four fires, it's in the Midrash Rabbah, then when we see the four colors of the horses in Revelation, then we may not match it up with this Torah portion. But rabbinically, it is matched up. So if you had been Jewish and you had these things handed down to you, and all of a sudden some guy is talking to you about a white horse, a red horse, a black horse, and a green horse or a green-yellow horse, you automatically have a context for that and say, wait a minute, those are the four fires of the Mishkan. So again, he's telling me go back to this particular Torah portion to understand what John is seeing. And of course, when those horsemen ride out, and being associated with the four living creatures, again, we go back to the cherubim. So that's what I'm talking about. When you make your own index so that you know what's in every single Torah portion, or at least a skeleton outline, when you do encounter something a little difficult to grasp in the Brit Chadashah, you can flip back through your index and say, wait a minute, these match. Tetzaveh matches. Bo is going to match because it means come. And that's exactly what the four living creatures are going to command, or Tetzaveh, to the horsemen. It's going to be bo, or come. We also have a Torah portion named bo, which is going to describe the same things that these horses bring out. And you say, well, that's a lot of Torah portions to connect with the book of Revelation. And I would have to agree, which makes my point exactly. If you don't know the Torah portions, then you don't know Revelation, right? But that's an example. And if I can remember each week, I'll try to do something like this that'll help you to learn how to do it. The more you see it done, the more you'll be able to do it yourself. But I would encourage you to do that. And if you're teaching other people, a lot of you are teachers. If you're teaching other people, just teach them this simple thing. And every year, it'll become more useful as they learn how to do it, because they will have more context in the Torah. See, right now, they may not even know what the titles of the Torah portions mean. They may not even know Tetzaveh means command. So they have to be willing to do this in yearly layers. It's not a quick fix to anything. But it is avodah. It's service, right? They're learning how to work in the garden. So we'll go on from here. I don't know why that is skipping. I'm the one that's doing it. I'm the one that's messing it up. Okay. Somehow I got those out of order. It's okay. I'm not quite myself yet, but the good news is I'm not anybody else either. So we're going to compare these two passages. We've got English and Hebrew, which is going to be the beginning of the Torah portion, starting in Exodus 27:20, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. And so he says, you shall charge the sons of Israel that they bring you clear oil of beaten olives for the light. And if you'll glance over to the right-hand side to the Hebrew, it's lama'or, lama'or, for the light, to make a lamp burn continually. And that is ner tamid. If you've ever been in a synagogue, you saw this light above the ark where the Torah scroll is, and the light never went out because it's a ner tamid. They keep it going all the time. It's a continual light. And he's saying, this is what I want the Israelites to do. I want them to bring this oil for the sake of the light, lama'or. Because remember when you did workbook 1, we talked about lemoedim, the sun, the moon, and the stars. They were created for the sake of the moedim. And so this clear oil is going to be for the sake of the light. He says, in the tent of meeting, outside the veil, which is before the testimony, Aharon and his sons shall keep it in order from evening to morning before the Lord. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout their generations for the sons of Israel. And you say, well, how can it be a perpetual statute if there's no tabernacle or temple anymore? Well, how many times in the Gospel of John, our good old boy John, does Yeshua speak to us and pray for us to be light? In fact, in the first chapter, he is called the light repeatedly. And it just says, you know, the world could not comprehend that light. And so John is all about light, light, light. And it goes back to the Mishkan being the pattern for the Babylonian exile, where they said, you know what, we could actually meet together. And we could read scripture. And we could talk about the scripture. And that eventually morphed into what we would call a proto-synagogue. And then by the 1st century, we see more of these synagogues where people meet to read the scripture, to discuss the scripture and the prophets, you know. But this is our example, that the light does not have to go out simply because the physical building is no longer there, that light can be carried in human beings. And we're going to see why. I'm going to show you linguistically why that can happen. The key phrase is it's going to drive us back to our first mention, from evening to morning, which tells us we need to look at 2 particular days of creation. We need to look at the first day of creation, where there was separation of darkness and light. And then we need to look at the 4th day of creation, where he put the sun and the moon as luminaries. Why? In order to separate, again, the day and the night, the light and the darkness. Again, the arrangement from evening to morning. And there's going to be an inherent goodness in this light. The first day of creation is pronounced Tov, so is the 4th day pronounced Tov. So there is a goodness to the light. Let's see. Okay. Here we go. So, or is to become light or to become bright. We're not talking about ner. When we hear menorah, you're hearing a noun construct. Ner is the nugget of menorah. And it has a relationship to the light, but it's a little bit different than the point right here. Because that basic root word or, which is usually translated light, it literally means to become light or to become bright. Right? So we have this ma'or, which is going to be derived from becoming light. Now, a ma'or is sometimes translated as a noun form as a luminary like the sun, a luminary like the moon, because it is a means of light. All right. In the sense of the sun and the moon, it's a means by which it becomes light. And we're pointed to that as an example, right? So if we think of, okay, has the sun become light? Yes, but it did not create its own light. There was a creator of the sun. So yes, it is becoming light. The moon, it doesn't really have a light of its own. It's showing another example, but it's reflecting the light of the sun. So it is still becoming light, regardless of what the job is. In its way, it is becoming a light. It is a luminary, and it's the means by which it becomes light. So if we compare that to a menorah, right? The menorah is the physical object. Light is less tangible. Now, if you're a scientist, light is much more tangible because you can talk about photons and stuff that the rest of us don't know how to pronounce. But the menorah is very much a tangible physical object. You can hold it in your hand. You can break it. You can form it. And so in that respect, it's very much like a human body. And so when you see the assemblies of Revelation warned that their candlestick or their lamp, depending on your translation, could be broken off, understand that that is a reference to their physical bodies. Because it's describing the vessel itself, not the light itself. And that makes you think of, okay, the proverb says, the Torah is a light. The commandment is a lamp. So it's describing the primary light and then the vessel for the light. And he's telling us, look, if we don't become a ma'or, a luminary, which originates from actually becoming light, from the Creator, then he says, I'll snuff out your life before you have fulfilled all the light that you were capable of being in the world. And now that's a pretty serious thing. People are taking their lives so casually in this generation. It's just nothing for people to commit suicide. And somehow we have lost that message that not only are you a human being that is very precious, but you're really only getting one chance to become all the light that you could possibly be in this world. Because if your life is snuffed out earlier than that time that was predestined for you, then you have failed to fulfill the potential of all the light you could become. And the more light you can become in the world, then the more that you can affect the world. Because in Revelation, it talks about Jerusalem, the holy city, where everything, there is so much light in this city because it says the lamp is a lamp. There's no need of the sun or the moon to shine in it. Why? Because the people in this city have become light. They have become like Yeshua. They are lights to the world, and therefore the kings of the earth will bring their glory and will bring their honor into it. So they have fulfilled their potential of the light that they could become in the world. If the nations have not yet brought their glory into Jerusalem, then we have not become all the light that we could be, to draw them in, to be that testimony. And so, again, it goes back to how do we present ourselves before the throne? We present ourselves as having done everything within our human ability to walk worthy of the light that he placed in us. Because ultimately it's about becoming light. It's about, like Yeshua said, eat my flesh, drink my blood. He didn't mean literally eat my flesh, drink my blood. Any commentary will tell you, it means take my teaching into you, take the word into you and let it become who you are. So it's the same thing. If the Torah is light, you take that light in and then it's what you become in the world. And that's what you were created to do, to be light. And as you learn and as you serve and as you guard, remember the 2 garden requirements: serve, avodah, and guard it. Keep the snakes out. The more of those 2 things you do, then the more the light you can be. So let's look at Revelation 21:17. And this is going to go back again to our Acacia boards from last week. That's why I say we've really not left last week behind. I want to keep looking at this acacia tree and the boards. Remember, it formed, the boards were not stacked, but they were stood around the tabernacle. They couldn't be stacked. That would have created ranks. They had to stand erect. They had to stand upright. So they're protecting the Mishkan itself. And then again, if we look at the Ark of the Covenant, has an outer layer gold box, has an inner layer gold box, but between gold and gold, there is an acacia or a shittim wood box. So the acacia, it's going to guard the heart of the Torah. I mean, it's immediately surrounding the Torah. But not only is it in this closest place where the Torah can rest, can have a resting place inside of the box, but it's also standing guard around the tabernacle itself. So there is a work of avodah, there's a work of service in the Mishkan with the acacia tree, but there's also an active act of guarding. Because as long as that wall is there, it's a partition. It's saying to the snake, stay out. Don't come in here. This is a holy place. This is where we learn how to be holy. So now we want to look at what John sees in his revelation. It says he measured its wall. And when it says wall, I want you to think about the wall around the Mishkan. Even though we're talking about the temple, there's going to be some similarities here. He measured its wall 72 yards, according to human measurements, he says, which are also angelic measurements. That's important. That's not a random statement. They're also angelic measurements. The material of the wall was jasper, and the city was pure gold, like clear glass. The foundation stones of the city wall were adorned with every kind of precious stone. And the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. And if you'll remember, within the rivers of Eden was good gold. That was the simple description. He says, I saw no temple in it, for the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb are its temple. And the city has no need of the sun or of the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God has illumined it. Right? In other words, you don't need the luminaries of the sun or the moon, which are the means by which you become light. Because the glory has illumined it, and this goes directly back to the Mishkan. Tomorrow when we start talking about the 4 fires, and it talks about mixing them with the dyes that Moses contributed from the people, that it actually created a glory. When those 2 things came together, it created a glory and an honor. And so he says, just like he starts out with the menorah commandment, I want you to make it to shine through the night. And so he says, in this case, what Moses saw, we can now see in fulfillment. John is seeing it in fulfillment. Whereas in the Mishkan, it had to function at a physical level. You had to have this literal candlestick. Well, in Revelation, it's the people who are the candlestick. It's the spirit of Adonai, yes, but it also says that it's the seven assemblies. So it's the people who would meet at the Ohel Moed, which means the tent of meeting, or the tent of the Moedim, or you would meet to celebrate the Moedim. So these are the people who should be meeting to celebrate the Moedim, which are associated with the fourth day of creation. Because remember, it says the sun, the moon, and the stars were created for the sake of the Moedim, the appointed times. And so if these seven candlesticks don't even know the appointed times, that's going to be a problem. How can they be the light that they were created to be when they don't even know when to light up? But he says this type of obedience, this sort of service, what will follow is that you will actually become this light. Like in what Moses saw was that God himself and the Lamb, they are the glory of the city. And that's what we are supposed to learn from looking at the menorah, that we are supposed to be that light, and we are supposed to know when to meet at the appointed times. And it says the nations will walk by its light. Why? Because they have become light. They have become Torah. The Torah is a light. Well, how do you get to be a light? Well, it tells you the commandment is a lamp. If you keep the commandment, you are the means by which the light can be shown in the world. And when the world can see the light, then it says the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. In the daytime, for there will be no night there, its gates will never be closed, and they will bring the glory and the honor of the nations into it. Right, so that's significant. What are you supposed to carry into the holy city on Shabbat? And Revelation is all about Shabbat. Everything is 77777. Revelation is about Shabbat and the Moedim, the appointed times. One thing you don't carry into the holy city on Shabbat or the high holy days is commercial goods. You don't carry a burden on the Sabbath that is not directly related to the celebration of that Sabbath. Right? So the idea that what the kings will bring in, remember Nehemiah was the one that had all the trouble with people bringing commercial goods into Jerusalem on the Shabbat, and not only were they bringing them in, the Jews were buying it. And so he literally had to shut the gates, lock them, and put guards at the gates. And so we live in a time where we have to guard the gate. You're in charge of Shabbat right now. You are in charge of your Shabbat. So a couple of things need to happen in your Shabbat. Number one, you need to serve. Avodah. There is a type of work that is done on Shabbat. It's service. That's why we say I went to service today, because it's a different kind of work, but it's work. Number two, you need to guard. You have to be like those Levites. You have to guard the gates to make sure that nobody is bringing a commercial burden into the holy city of Shabbat in order to conduct weekday commerce. And the more you can do those two things, the more you will be light in the earth. The more you can do those two things, the easier it's going to be when Messiah's reign begins for the kings to be able to bring glory and honor into the gates rather than dragging their commercial goods into the gate. And that's why Babylon the Great has to fall. Because remember, Babylon there's two things we need to remember. Number one, it's based on commerce. And number two, it's based on uncleanness or a lack of holiness. That's why we say Egypt is on this one side where we're talking about salvation. Okay, we've left that behind. Now we got to talk about Babylon. Have I served and learned holiness? Have I learned to guard the holy things in my exile in Babylon? Well, if I haven't learned to guard the holy things in Babylon, I'm going to have real difficulty going into the holy city, just the way that Ezra and Nehemiah described it, because the ones who did follow them back weren't necessarily icons of obedience. They were marrying foreign women. They were putting their brothers into forced labor. They were doing exactly the things they were told not to do. And so obviously there was less glory being attached to the rebuilding of the temple. What we're supposed to carry into it on Shabbat is not commercial goods. We're supposed to carry glory and honor, that part of our service. And John says the measurements here are angelic. And when he says angelic, we need to look to the walls of the Mishkan. Remember, the boards make up the walls of the Mishkan. They stand erect. And according to tradition, what they represent is the seraphim. Because it says the seraphim, they basically stood and, they protect, which he doesn't need protection, but in terms of, the setup of the throne, you've got cherubim, you've got seraphim around the throne, and they each have a particular job. But they say that the walls of the Mishkan, seraphim, by the way, means fiery, that they represent these walls because they guarded the Mishkan itself. Just like in the inner precincts, the cherubim are going to guard, like they're woven into the veil. They're atop the Ark of the Covenant on the cover. And so the seraphim are going to represent the walls of the Mishkan. The walls of the Mishkan represent the seraphim. And it's an angelic way of measuring things out. That the wall that stood around it actually represents beings that are in attendance to the Holy One. So let's go back to Genesis 1. Let's go back to our first mention. And I didn't put the entire passage in Hebrew, but I put a sample verse in there so you could see how many times this word ma'or appears, which is the means of becoming light. So Genesis 1:14, then God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons, for moedim. What is the light for? What is this menorah for? Well, he tells us very specifically what light is for. It's for signs, it's for seasons, and it's for days and years. Significantly, Moses is told when he encounters the burning bush, he says, this is going to be a sign for you. You're going to come back and you're going to worship me on this mountain. Right? What is a sign? It's part of the seasons. It's part of the moedim. So when he gives us a menorah with lights, then he's incorporating these seasons of the moedim into the message. He says, let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth. And it was so. And Ezekiel's going to describe this in minute detail, by the way. God made the two great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. He made the stars also. God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth and to govern the day and the night and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. There was evening and there was morning, a fourth day. Right? So our creation language is embedded right here into this Torah portion, Tetzaveh, ma'or, right? The means of becoming light. And it is associated with the moedim. You've got the Moedim mentioned specifically in Genesis 1. You've got the very name of the Mishkan, Ohel Moed, the tent of the Moed. And then you've got John specifically relating to 7 assemblies. And the only assemblies John would have known about would have been the 7 Moedim. He didn't know anything about First Baptist or Methodist or Catholics and so forth. Those things didn't exist. There were only 7 Moedim for him. And so from beginning to middle to end, it's all tied into the Moedim, the way that we become light, the means that we become light in the earth is connected to the menorah and the Moedim. It says he made the stars also. We could probably do a whole lesson on why that's separated in terms of like, oh, and yeah, by the way, the stars. Because the primary luminaries, and the stars are the sons and daughters of Abraham, by the way. But there is a greater mission. The stars don't necessarily govern the Moedim. They will be a sign of the Moedim for sure, but you have to factor the sun, you have to factor the moon in order to be able to calculate your biblical calendar. Right? Yes, the stars play into it, but they're not the primary luminaries. Okay, so Rabbi Kahn is commenting to this particular Torah portion, and I thought it was just ironic that he's talking about Revelation as the revelation of the Mishkan at Sinai, and a typical Christian thinks of the Revelation as a book in the New Testament. But he writes the Mishkan, and not the Beit HaMikdash, which I misspelled, which is the temple, if you're not familiar with that, was built first. In other words, the tabernacle was built before the temple. He says the desert and not Mount Moriah was the venue. Yet the theological truth remains unchanged. The Beit HaMikdash, and by default the Mishkan, enable us to bring the revelation into our daily existence. So he's saying the building of the temple, even though it was so glorious, it was not built first. It was the Mishkan. And it was built in the desert. It was built in the Midbar. It wasn't built on Mount Moriah. There was prophecy before that, and then there was fulfillment in the time of King Shlomo. But for a season, the tabernacle, the Mishkan, and the Midbar, the wilderness, that's where everything comes together. And so he's saying this pattern, which again, they use that in Babylon as the prototype for a synagogue. But this pattern showed us how we're going to be able to bring the revelation, the Torah, and its Mishkan into our daily existence. So we know the Torah, the word, is the revelation. The Torah is also the light. We want to bring the light. We want to bring the Torah, the word, into our daily existence, because that is the revelation. And in Yeshua, we saw that human manifestation of the word in daily existence. And so we're imitating him. Like him, we can be light in the world. We can function like the sun and the moon as luminaries in physical bodies. And the word there is tamid, always, a perpetual light. In other words, we can always be light, even through the night. That was part of the function. In the darkness is when you would actually notice that someone is light in the world. Why do times have to get so hard? Why do they have to get so bad? Because without it, we won't necessarily stand out as light in the world. And that's why we don't want to look just like everyone else. It says, come out of her, my people. come out of Babylon. Why? He wants you to be the full light you can be. If you're walking in uncleanness, and then you're walking in Shabbat compromise like the rest of Babylon, how will you stand out through the night when the night comes? We have to learn to be light in order for that shine. And remember, it was the clear oil of beaten olives. You're going to get beat up. Oh, that's the alarm. And I obviously put it somewhere else. That's why tribulation comes. Because until then, we don't really know who is truly shining the light of the Torah. Okay, hang on just a second. Okay. That was my 5-yard dash. So let's at least get to this midbar and why it's important. It says, now Moses, this is Exodus 3:1, by the way. We're backing up a little. Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire. Yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. He said, certainly I will be with you, and this shall be the sign to you, that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. Right? So this mountain goes by a few different names. Horeb is one, and Sinai is one. So he says, here's going to be a sign for you. In our first mention of signs, remember, was back in our creation, where they show the luminaries, the sun and the moon, they're going to be a sign for you. They're going to be for seasons, for the moed, to tell you the appointed times. And so when he says, this is going to be a sign, you're going to come back and you're going to worship me on this mountain. Remember, it's at Shavuot that Israel comes to worship on the mountain. They come at an appointed time, at a moed. It's the fourth feast, which coincides with the creation of the sun, the moon, and the stars as the luminaries. So there's nothing coincidental here. Everything is lining up in a beautiful fourth day pattern. So he says, this is going to be the sign. You're going to come back and you're going to worship me at a moed. And this bush is also going to be for you a sign, because remember, the mountain was on fire, but yet the people were not consumed by it. Neither was Moses. And that seems to be part of the sign, is that you can walk through the fire, that fire being the presence of Adonai, but it's not going to burn you up. So, just to recap, it says, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush. And a bush is sneh. It says, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. So Moses said, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, while the bush is not burned up. So we see the angel is in the fire, or maybe he is the fire. Remember, we become light. It says the bush itself, the physical aspect of the bush, it's unaffected. And again, when we think in terms of resurrection, that's exactly what we want to hear, is that this body of flesh can be restored and be unaffected by fire or flood or whatever that, would normally be destructive to a fallen human being. And what he's seeing, he says, this is really marvelous. Now, a sneh is a thorny bush. And this particular context tells us it was growing in the western wilderness. Well, if he starts from Midianite territory, then the western side of that territory is going to be the Arava and the Negev desert. It's going to be in the Midbar that we're talking about. And this is what Adonai, he says, certainly I will be with you. And this shall be the sign to you, that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God at this mountain. That mountain, remember, is also Sinai. So maybe some of the pattern that Moses received for the Mishkan was not just in that 40-day time period up on the mountain. Maybe some of the pattern that Moses saw, he actually saw at the burning bush. This marvelous bush that he turns aside to see. When we think of the acacia trees, and remember, this is the only wooden structure within the Mishkan. I don't know what this crazy bird is doing. When we came back at Passover last year, we had bluebirds trying to get in the house, and we just, got back from the dig, and the birds are back trying to get in the house, and it's after 10 o'clock at night. I don't know what the deal is with the birds. So we've got the acacia tree, or the shita tree. And remember, that is vital to the ecosystem of the Midbar, which is where Moses is seeing this marvelous thing, this burning sneh, or thorny bush, in the western wilderness, which would place him in the Arava or the Negev. If you look at this picture I took, this was up toward the Scorpion's Ascent, looking back toward a mountain they call Mount Sin. Some people think that that is Mount Hor, where Aaron died. There's a debate. But what I wanted you to see was actually the acacia trees down in the Wadi. Those acacia trees in the Midbar are not big trees. I showed you last week a picture of one that was irrigated, and it was a pretty good sized tree. But out in the Midbar, they don't grow to be that tall. They're more like a bush. And it does have thorns. So it could be, by seeing this burning bush, if this is an acacia tree, which is going to be the most common bush that you would see in the Midbar, especially, well, it seems like all the bushes in the Midbar are thorny. So that part of it is not that special. But what would he be most likely to see? Probably an acacia tree. When there's nothing else, there'll be an acacia tree there. And in the Midbar, it's never going to get very tall. In this, you can see, is actually down in a Wadi, which is where the water will run in the flash floods. And even with that extra water source, you can see that they're not very big at all. Okay, so Horeb, this mountain is also called Mount Horeb, where he receives the Torah. And it actually means desert. And I gave you the Strong's number there of 2717. And it's in the Midbar, or the wilderness, that we see that it's blocking the way to the land of Israel as they travel from Egypt. So between Egypt and Israel is a mountain called Sinai, or Horeb, in the Midbar. Now, Horeb, again, it means desert, it means dry. But the root of it is what's significant, because we've been going back to the creation, going back to the garden. Its root is charav. Charav means to be dried up, like a dried up water, a dried up river. And think of that, what it would have been like to be expelled from the garden, where you have these thunderous rivers of Eden that give drink to the whole garden, and all of a sudden you're kicked out and you're back in a dry place. You dry up spiritually. And it also means to be desolate or to be laid waste. So Horeb stands between death, Egypt, and then actually entering into the promised land. It's blocking the way. And you've heard this before. Going back again to the expulsion from the garden, it says, so he drove the man out, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he stationed the cherubim and the flaming sword, which turned every direction to guard the way to the tree of life. All right, so think of this heavenly chariot, and we'll read more in it tomorrow about the heavenly chariot. But remember, it could go in any direction without turning. And that's exactly the way that the flaming sword, or the cherev, you can hear the same root there as Horeb, where they received the Torah. It turns in every direction. To do what? To do exactly what they should have been doing, which is guarding the way to the tree of life. Remember, if you can't do two things, if you cannot serve and you cannot guard, you got no business in the garden. And so we have this wilderness where there is Horeb standing between them and that ultimate re-entry. Remember, the tradition says that had they not sinned with the golden calf at Sinai, at Horeb, that they could have actually gone into the land and entered into immortality. That was the original plan. And of course, the golden calf destroyed that. But they had to be tested at Horeb. A sword in Hebrew is cherev, and it means to make thirsty. And what's really interesting here, and I guess we'll have to stop here because of time, they were basically divorced. If you look at the language in Hebrew, it says vayegaresh, vayegaresh. And a grusha in Hebrew is a divorced woman. A grush is a divorced man. And so that's the verb that's being used here. It's a divorce word that's being used when it says he drove them out. It's basically saying and drove away and divorced the man and sent him away. All right. And then he stations at the east of the Garden of Eden, the cherubim. And he talks about the sword, ha-cherev, right? And it's going to guard the way to the tree of life. So my thought question is, the text doesn't really say the cherubim are holding the flaming sword, because it says and you can see in the Hebrew it says ve et lahat hacherev. I've always seen it as the cherubim holding the sword, but the text doesn't literally say they're holding the sword. It says he placed the cherubim there and the flaming sword, which turned every direction. Now, that's not to say they aren't the same thing. I think they are very much connected. But that spirit of Elohim, that flaming sword, his chariot guards the way. And I think this is why we're seeing the phrase chariots of Israel as we were reading over about Elisha and Eliyahu. Why Eliyahu is taken up in a chariot. Why? Because that chariot guards the way, but it's also how you pass from there to here, here to there, is through this chariot. Now remember, chariot is kind of we have a human image of what that chariot is, but what Ezekiel saw is the chariot isn't much like a chariot as we would see it, like on Ben-Hur, okay? It's actually the four living beings that can go in any direction, wherever the Spirit tells them to go. And of course, they have these wheels within the wheels, like I've shown you on the menorah before. So at that point, and I guess we got to stop there, it could be that as we're looking at Mount Horeb in Sinai, they're being reminded again of the flaming sword, the cherub. And they've been led back to the tree of life. They've been led back to the Torah at Horeb. And so if this is what Moses was seeing, if the burning bush was actually the acacia, we can see why it would need to form the walls and the Ark of the Covenant, because it's going to be a symbol of the burning angel, a seraph. And if we think of even the serpents in the wilderness that attacked them, they were called seraphim. They weren't just natural snakes. There was something semi-supernatural going on with those snakes. They were burning snakes. And that's exactly what Sinai means. It means thorny. Seraphim means fiery. So what was the acacia? It was a fiery, thorny, burning bush. So it's highly symbolic in terms of entering the garden. And this is what Moses told. This is going to be a sign for you. Looking at this tree, this experience with this burning bush, this is going to be a sign for you, because you're going to come right back to this place and you're going to worship on this mountain. And if that is the symbolism of the burning bush, if that is the symbolism of the midbar, where everybody is taken to be tested, what is that telling you? If you're really going to take that next step, if you're going to go from salvation to holiness, if you're going to learn to serve me, if you are going to learn to guard the way to the tree of life, then you really need to pass the midbar test. You need to pass the wilderness test. Because that's where you're going to encounter the flaming bush. That's where you're going to encounter fiery things. But it's also where you're going to re-encounter the tree of life. It's here that you're going to learn about the heavenly chariot and your return into that garden. But it's there that you truly have to grow. That you have to learn to be upright. You have to learn to guard the Mishkan. And you have to learn to take the Torah into your heart. So even though, yes, you know, you're a thorny, lightweight piece of wood in the wilderness, nevertheless, you are encased in good gold. And in that contrast, maybe we can understand even why Yeshua had to be taken into the wilderness to be tested. The wilderness, the midbar, is where you go for that to occur before you cross over.